Everyone in the neighborhood froze when the sound of a gunshot cracked through the quiet evening air. A mother screamed. A dog barked. Windows slammed shut. And there in the middle of the cul-de-sac, my teenage son stood with his hands in the air, his sleeve torn, smoke still curling from the barrel of the gun pointed at him. The woman holding it, the HOA president, Karen. Her face was twisted, eyes wide with something between rage and fear, and for one terrifying second I thought I'd just lost him. But let me back up. We moved into that neighborhood hopping for peace. Hopping for a place where my boy could finish high school without worry, where the only battles he'd face were over homework or basketball games. We weren't looking for trouble, but trouble, it found us the very first week. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, came storming up our driveway before we'd even unpacked the last box. She complained about the moving truck blocking the street. She criticized the color of our shutters. She pointed at my son's car, an old, beat-up pickup he and I had rebuilt together, and sneered that it was an eyesore. That was her favorite word, eyesore. As if a kid's first car, earned with sweat and scraped knuckles, was an insult to her kingdom of perfect lawns. At first, I tried to laugh it off. I told my son, some people just need control to feel safe. Ignore her. But the truth was she didn't want peace. She wanted power. And my son, he had a way of standing tall even when he was being looked down on. Karen hated that. The days turned into weeks and her harassment grew sharper. Letters in the mailbox, fines that didn't make sense, warnings taped to our door. But nothing compared to that night, the one burned into my memory. It was just after sunset. My son had been shooting hoops at the end of the driveway. Sweat on his brow, music playing low from his phone, a normal teenager moment. I was inside, rinsing dishes, when I heard her voice, sharp, cutting through the air like broken glass. "What did I tell you about making noise in this neighborhood?" she snapped. I walked outside just in time to see her storming toward him. He held the basketball at his hip, confused, tired of the fight. "It's 7 o'clock," he said quietly. "I'm not hurting anyone." But Karen didn't hear reason. Her hand went to her purse. For a heartbeat, I thought maybe she'd pull out another violation slip, another ridiculous fine. But what she pulled instead made my stomach drop. "A handgun." She raised it with both hands, her voice shaking but furious. I told you this neighborhood has rules." And then boom. The ball dropped from my son's hands as he stumbled backward, his shirt torn where the bullet grazed him. For a moment, the whole world went silent. Even Karen seemed shocked at what she'd just done. Her breath hitched, her eyes darting around as if she could erase the sound. But me, I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. All I saw was my boy, his arm bleeding, his eyes wide, his body frozen. Neighbors peeked through blinds, but no one came out. Not one person rushed forward, not one voice shouted for help. They all just watched. And in that suffocating silence, something inside me shifted. Because Karen thought she knew everything about us. She thought we were just another family to bully, another set of rules to bend to her will. What she didn't know was who my son really was. And what bloodline he carried. Everyone saw it, everyone heard it, but no one moved. My son's blood stained the pavement in front of our house, and Karen stood there gripping that pistol like she was still deciding whether to fire again. Her lips trembled, her knuckles white, but the gun didn't lower, not even an inch. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But something in the air froze me in place. It was the same silence I remembered from long ago, the kind that settles on a battlefield right before the second round of gunfire begins. The kind where breath feels heavy and every second stretches like eternity. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about an HOA rule anymore. This was war. My boy touched his arm, staring at the blood on his hand like he couldn't believe it was his. "You shot me," he whispered, his voice more disbelief than pain. "You actually shot me." Karen's face twisted. "It was a warning shot," she snapped, as though saying the words would undo what she'd done. Her voice cracked, but her eyes held that same cruel certainty she'd worn since day one. "You were resisting the rules. I told you what happens when people don't listen in this neighborhood." I could hear curtains rustling, neighbors whispering inside their perfect houses. None of them stepped out. None of them dared to cross her. She had them all under her thumb, and they'd let her get away with anything, even firing at a teenager. But she didn't know. She didn't know who my son really was. I took a step forward, every muscle in my body screaming with rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. Rage makes you sloppy. And if there's one thing I learned from my years in uniform, it's this: never go sloppy when a weapon's already drawn. "Karen," I said slowly, carefully, like I was talking to a wild animal. "Put the gun down." Her hands shook, but she didn't budge. Behind me, my son whispered, "Dad?" His voice cracked, fear leaking through, but there was something else in it too, something steady, something I recognized, because he wasn't just my son, he was my blood. And my blood carried a history Karen would never be able to comprehend. I didn't serve, not directly, but my father did, my brother did, and my son trained under one of the sharpest eyes this country ever knew. A sniper, military, elite. Every summer while other kids went to camp, mine spent his weeks on the range with his uncle, learning patience, breathing, precision. He learned not just how to shoot, but how to see, how to read people, how to survive. Karen thought she was pointing a weapon at a helpless kid. She didn't know she'd just pulled a trigger on someone who'd spent years learning how to keep calm under fire. Someone who knew more about the weight of a bullet than she ever would. But that wasn't the part that scared me most. The part that scared me was how still he stood, how steady his eyes were, like he'd already calculated 10 different ways this could end. And in that moment, I saw it, the soldier inside him. A soldier he'd never wanted to be, but one life had forced him to become. "Dad," he said again, quieter this time, "it's okay." But it was okay. Nothing about it was okay. The police should have been called. The neighbors should have stepped in. But instead, the street sat in suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Karen's ragged breathing. And then, like a match to gasoline, her anger flared again. "You people think you can come into my neighborhood and break my rules? Not on my watch." Her voice rose, shrill, carrying across every lawn and driveway. She waved the gun in the air, gesturing toward the houses around us. "This is what happens when outsiders move in. This is what happens when you think the rules don't apply to you." Her words weren't just for us. They were for them, the neighbors hiding behind their curtains, listening. She was putting on a show, a performance meant to remind them who was in charge. And for a moment I saw their shadows retreat. Not one door opened. Not one person raised a voice. My son shifted, blood dripping down his arm. His eyes flicked toward me just for a second. And in that second I knew what he was asking. He didn't want me to act. He wanted permission. Permission to step into the role he'd been trained for. Permission to end this before it got worse. But how could I let him? He was just a kid, my kid. And yet, when I looked at him, I didn't see a boy anymore. I saw the sniper's steady patience. The soldier's calm. The man he'd been forged into long before either of us realized it. Karen didn't know it then, but the moment she pulled that trigger, the balance of power shifted. She thought she had the upper hand because she had the gun. But in reality, she just armed the wrong person with a reason to fight back. And fight back he would. Because that night wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning. The sirens came slow, too slow. By the time the flashing lights painted the street in red and blue, Karen had already tucked the pistol back into her purse, her voice rehearsed, her face composed. She stood at the edge of the driveway, waiting as though she had called them herself. And maybe she had. I pressed a rag to my son's arm, my hands shaking though I didn't want him to see it. He winced, but his eyes stayed fixed on her, calm, sharp, unblinking. That calm scared me more than the bleeding. 2 officers stepped out of the cruiser, hands on their belts. They didn't look at my boy first. They didn't even look at me. They walked straight toward her. "Ma'am," one said, nodding politely, "you the one who called this in." Called it in, my stomach dropped. She had gotten to them first. Karen nodded, crocodile tears already welling in her eyes. "Yes, officer, thank goodness you're here. I was terrified. This young man," she pointed at my son, bleeding on the pavement, "he threatened me. He's been harassing me for weeks. Tonight he rushed me and I had no choice. I fired in self-defense." Her words hung heavy in the air, twisting reality. I shot to my feet. "That's a lie," my voice cracked, raw with fury. She pulled a gun on him. He was playing basketball in our driveway when she marched up and shot at him. The officers finally looked at me, then at my son. One of them frowned at the blood, at the torn shirt, but the other just scribbled on his notepad. "Sir, let's calm down," he said. "We'll get everyone's statements." Calm down. My boy had nearly been killed, and they wanted me calm. Karen sniffled dramatically, pulling a tissue from her bag. "I tried to warn them," she whimpered, glancing at the houses around us. "I told them I'd enforce the rules, but they don't listen, and now—" She let her voice trail off like she was too shaken to continue. And just like that, the neighbors' blinds fluttered shut again. Not one person stepped forward. Not one soul said, "I saw her fire first." Because Karen wasn't just a neighbor. She was the HOA president. She held the power to fine them, to threaten them, to make their lives miserable. And fear makes cowards of decent people. I clenched my fists, but before I could speak again, my son's voice cut through the night. Low, steady. "She missed," he said simply, his eyes never leaving hers. "She was aiming at my chest." The officers froze. Even Karen's face faltered for half a second, like the mask slipped. Then she forced a laugh, sharp and brittle. Listen to him, dramatic just like his father, always exaggerating. But the way her hand shook as she dabbed her eyes, that gave her away. The cops asked more questions, but it was clear where this was headed. They weren't going to arrest her. They weren't even going to take her gun. They muttered about conflicting reports, about needing more evidence. And when they finally left, they left us standing there in the dark, my son's arm still bleeding, Karen smirking like she'd just won. That smirk burned into me. Inside, I cleaned his wound, my hands careful, my mind racing. "We'll get her," I promised. "We'll get justice." But my son shook his head. "Not like that." His voice was calm, too calm, the kind of calm that comes when anger has burned itself into something colder, something sharper. "She thinks she knows how this ends," he murmured, staring out the window at her porch light glowing across the street. "But she doesn't know me." And in that moment, I saw the soldier again, the one his uncle had trained, the one who'd spent summers in the dirt, learning to hold his breath for 60 seconds straight, to slow his heart until even its beat wouldn't throw off his aim. The boy who could tell wind direction by the way a single leaf turned. Karen had woken something she didn't understand. But justice takes patience. The next morning, the HOA sent out an email. Not an apology, not an explanation, a warning. Recent events have proven the need for strict compliance with neighborhood rules. Disruptive behavior will not be tolerated. Violators will face consequences. No mention of Karen, no mention of the gun, just a threat wrapped in official HOA language. I watched neighbors nod at her when they passed, pretending nothing had happened. They avoided my eyes. Some looked ashamed, others afraid, but none spoke up. That was when it hit me. She had them all. She had this whole place in her grip, and if we wanted justice, we'd have to take it ourselves. My son sat at the kitchen table, rolling a bullet casing between his fingers. Not the one from last night. One his uncle had given him years ago, engraved with 3 words, patience, precision, purpose. He caught me staring. "Dad," he said softly, "do you trust me?" My throat tightened, because I knew what he was really asking. Did I trust the man he was becoming, the soldier he never asked to be, but life had made him anyway? And though fear clawed at me, though every instinct screamed to keep him safe, I nodded. "Yes," I said, "I trust you." Karen thought she'd buried the truth under fear and silence. What she didn't know was that silence can be a weapon too. And my son was about to use it. Everyone thought it was over. They thought the shot fired in the cul-de-sac would fade into whispers, then disappear like all the other things the HOA buried. The email from Karen had sealed the story. Nothing happened. Nothing to see. Move on. But silence doesn't mean nothing. Sometimes silence is strategy. My son knew that. He went back to school the next day, his arm bandaged, his shirt sleeve pulled low. He didn't complain, didn't whine, didn't even bring it up. To anyone else, he looked like the same quiet kid, head down, getting through the week. But I saw it. The shift. The way his eyes tracked more, noticed more, cataloged more, he wasn't sulking, he was studying. Karen mistook his silence for weakness. By the end of that week, she was bolder than ever. A bright red violation notice taped to our door. A fine for excessive noise, even though we'd spent the night inside. Another warning about the truck in the driveway, this time with a threat of towing. She even smiled when she passed me on the street. That same thin, venomous smile that said, "I own this place, and you can't touch me." I wanted to break her smugness, to march across the street and show her what she'd done. But every time I thought about it, my son's voice echoed in my head, "Not like that." He knew something I didn't. It started small. He'd sit on the porch in the evenings, his notebook open, his pen scratching slow, deliberate lines. I thought he was journaling, but one night I looked closer. He wasn't writing feelings, he was making maps. Detailed sketches of the neighborhood, angles of the streetlights, lines of sight from porches where shadows fell at certain hours. Notes about who came outside and when, which blinds opened, which doors stayed locked. It wasn't paranoia, it was reconnaissance. "Why are you doing this?" I asked quietly one night, when I caught him drawing the curve of Karen's front yard for the third time. He didn't look up, because she's not going to stop, and if no one else will hold her accountable, then we have to. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was steel in it, a kind of certainty I hadn't heard before. And I realized this wasn't about revenge for him, not exactly. This was about justice, about balance, about making sure she couldn't hurt anyone else. Meanwhile, Karen escalated. She didn't just target us. A neighbor down the block got a fine for grass length. Another family received a warning for leaving toys in their yard, and each time she'd stand in the middle of the street, waving papers, making an example out of them, reminding everyone who held the power. The neighborhood bent under her will, but cracks were forming. I saw it in the way Mr. Anderson avoided her eyes when she shouted at his wife. I saw it in the way the Johnson kids whispered when she passed. Quiet resentment was building, but resentment without action is just rot. And then one night I found my son in the garage, not with a weapon, not with anger, but with discipline. He was cleaning his uncle's old spotting scope, the one that hadn't seen daylight in years. "What are you planning?" I asked, fear knotting in my chest. He looked up, meeting my eyes. "I'm planning to wait." Wait, that word sent chills through me, because waiting is the sniper's greatest weapon. Patience, precision, purpose. The three words engraved on the bullet casing he kept in his pocket. Karen didn't know it, but every step she took, every word she barked, every smug smile she wore was being logged, measured, studied. Not out of obsession, out of strategy. Days turned into weeks, and she only grew louder. She bragged at HOA meetings about keeping the neighborhood safe. She painted herself as the hero, the protector. She twisted the story of that night until it was legend, the fearless president who stood down a dangerous teenager. And people clapped, not because they believed her, but because they were afraid not to. But behind those claps, I saw eyes flicker, doubt simmer. And when I glanced at my son, I saw something else. He wasn't angry, he was waiting. The night it shifted was the night of the storm. Rain hammered the roofs, wind rattled fences, and thunder rolled over the mountains. Power flickered, and for a moment the neighborhood was swallowed in darkness. From the porch, my son leaned forward, eyes locked across the street. Karen's house glowed like a fortress, her porch light fighting the storm. "Tonight," he murmured, "she'll feel it." I wanted to ask what he meant. I wanted to stop him. But something in his voice, steady, cold, certain, told me there was no stopping what was already in motion. And when the lights finally snapped back on, something in the air had changed. Karen didn't know it yet, but the silence she thought she owned was no longer hers. The first strike wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was silence. Karen woke one morning to find her pristine mailbox door hanging open, the inside empty. No letters, no HOA forms, no bills, nothing. She stormed up and down the street, demanding to know who had tampered with her mail. Neighbors shrugged. No one admitted to seeing a thing. What she didn't know was that my son had been watching, from the porch, from the shadows, from angles she never even realized were exposed. It wasn't about stealing. It wasn't about vandalizing. It was about precision. He hadn't touched a single envelope. He just loosened the screws at the base of the box a week earlier, knowing the storm winds would do the rest. A small detail, invisible until the perfect moment. By the end of that day, Karen had filed a police report. But when officers found nothing missing, they left with clipped voices and tired eyes. She stood in her driveway shouting after them, humiliated, while neighbors peeked from behind curtains. That was the beginning. The next week her sprinkler system failed. Not broken, not destroyed, just off. Her perfect lawn browned at the edges while the rest of the neighborhood stayed green. She cursed at the landscaping crew, accused them of sabotage, threatened to fine them. They quit on the spot. Another crack in her armor. And all the while, my son sat quiet, patient, his notebook filling with new observations. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to fight her in the open. He just needed to let her unravel herself. Because people like Karen, they thrive on control. Take away the illusion of it and they collapse. But Karen wasn't collapsing yet. She fought harder. HOA meetings turned uglier. She stood at the front of the clubhouse, waving her hands, spitting threats. She accused the neighborhood of conspiring against her. She demanded loyalty. And in the back of the room, my son sat silently, watching. Every glare she threw, he met with calm eyes. Every accusation he absorbed without a word. And though she shouted louder, though she tried to paint him as the villain, I could feel the tide shifting. Because the neighbors weren't blind. They'd seen her gun that night. They'd heard the shot. They'd swallowed their fear for weeks. But fear can only hold people so long before it turns to shame. And shame grows heavy. The real break came one evening when Karen marched across the street, a clipboard clutched in her hands. She pounded on our door, her voice shrill enough to pierce glass. "Come out," she demanded. "Come out and face me." I stepped outside, heart hammering, ready for another confrontation. But my son was already there, standing on the porch steps, calm as ever. Karen thrust the clipboard toward him. "Sign this. You're being fined for noncompliance again." He didn't move, didn't blink, just studied her face, silent. Seconds ticked by. The silence stretched, uncomfortable, unbearable. Neighbors peered from porches, waiting for an explosion. But the explosion never came. He simply smiled, small, controlled, almost amused, then turned and walked back inside without saying a word. Karen's face turned red. She screamed after him, rattling threats, but the power was gone. The silence had already broken her. Because silence, when wielded right, speaks louder than words. The next morning she found a bullet casing on her porch. Not new, not fired, just old brass glinting in the sun, engraved with 3 words: patience, precision, purpose. She picked it up with shaking hands, her eyes darting across the street. Our curtains didn't move. Our door stayed shut. But she knew someone was watching. For the first time since we'd moved in, I saw fear on her face. And that fear spread. She stopped walking the neighborhood, stopped barking at kids on bikes, stopped standing at the clubhouse podium like a queen. Instead, she peeked out windows. She double-locked her doors. She turned on every light at night, afraid of the dark. The neighbors noticed. They whispered. They smirked when she wasn't looking. The balance was shifting. But my son didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He just sat with his notebook, writing, planning, waiting. "Why the casing?" I asked one night, my voice low, worried. He looked at me with steady eyes. "Because now she knows what patience feels like." His words chilled me, not because of the threat behind them, but because of the calm, the certainty. Karen thought she had silenced the neighborhood. What she didn't realize was that silence had turned against her. And it was only the beginning. The neighborhood used to bend when Karen spoke. Her word was law, her clipboard the gavel, her fines the sentence. But something was different now. Something had shifted. At first it was subtle. Neighbors didn't greet her with the same forced smiles. They didn't nod quite as quickly when she barked an order. She noticed, and she hated it. I watched from the porch as she stormed down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, muttering to herself. Every car parked slightly offline was a personal attack. Every child's bicycle in a driveway was defiance. Every laugh, every whisper was about her. At least, that's what she thought. Because paranoia doesn't need proof, it only needs silence. And silence was everywhere now. Karen started calling emergency HOA meetings. She demanded stricter enforcement of rules. She waved papers in the air, her voice rising higher each time. "We are losing control of this community," she shouted one evening, red-faced, pounding the podium so hard the microphone squealed. "If we let one family disobey, it spreads. It infects everyone." Her words echoed across the clubhouse, but the response was muted. Neighbors shifted in their seats, eyes down, lips pressed tight. They weren't clapping anymore. They weren't afraid enough anymore. And in the back of the room, my son sat silent, hands folded, watching her unravel. Karen's eyes kept flicking toward him. Every time she raised her voice, every time she demanded obedience, she'd glance at the boy who didn't flinch. The boy who just watched. And in that quiet stare, she saw something she couldn't control, something she couldn't find, something she couldn't erase. That stare haunted her. Soon, she stopped walking alone at night. She carried her gun everywhere, even to HOA meetings, tucked into her purse but obvious enough for everyone to notice. She told the neighbors she wasn't afraid, but the way her hand trembled when she adjusted her glasses said otherwise. And then the little things started happening again. Her porch light flickered one night, though the bulb was brand new. A sprinkler head cracked, spraying water across her driveway until it froze in the winter air, leaving a slick sheet of ice. Her trash bins tipped over in the wind, except no one else's did. Tiny, meaningless things, or at least that's how they looked. But paranoia doesn't see meaningless, it sees messages. And Karen saw every one of them as a warning. She started accusing people, at meetings, in emails, even in grocery store aisles. "I know you're against me," she hissed at Mrs. Johnson when the woman refused to second her motion for new parking restrictions. "You're all working together," she snapped at Mr. Anderson when he dared to park on the street overnight. Neighbors began to avoid her entirely. They crossed the street when she came walking. They ignored her emails. They skipped meetings. The queen of the HOA was becoming a ghost in her own kingdom. But ghosts don't fade quietly. One night, close to midnight, I heard shouting outside. I opened the blinds and saw her standing in the middle of the street, her robe clutched tight around her, hair wild, eyes wild. She was screaming into the darkness. "I know you're watching me. I know what you're doing." Her voice cracked. She spun in circles, waving her gun in one hand, the bullet casing in the other. She held it up to the sky like it was proof of some conspiracy. "You think I'm scared? You think I don't know what this means?" Windows lit up one by one, neighbors peeking out, whispering. My son stood beside me at the window, calm as ever, eyes locked on her. "She's breaking," I whispered. He didn't answer, he didn't need to. His silence said everything. The next morning, the HOA board called an emergency session. Not to discipline Karen, not yet. But the cracks were showing. I heard murmurs, directors questioning her decisions, her behavior, her outbursts. For the first time, people were saying it out loud. Maybe Karen wasn't fit to lead. And when power starts slipping, desperation takes hold. Karen doubled down. She printed new rules overnight. Curfew restrictions, parking bans, noise ordinances so absurd they outlawed kids' laughter after 8 p.m. She went door to door, shoving notices into mail slots, threatening fines that no one believed she could enforce. But the more she tightened her grip, the more the neighborhood pulled away. And all the while, my son stayed quiet. He didn't argue, he didn't fight, he didn't even acknowledge the notices taped to our door, he just waited. Because patience breaks louder than anger. One evening I found him sitting on the porch, the spotting scope propped beside him. Not aimed at her house. Not aimed anywhere, really, just there. A reminder, a shadow. "Why the scope?" I asked. He didn't look at me. His eyes stayed on the street, calm, steady. "Because she needs to feel what it's like to live under a watchful eye." I swallowed hard, because I knew he wasn't wrong. Karen had forced us to live under her gaze for months, every move judged, every choice fined. And now, for the first time, she was the one being watched. The irony cut sharp. That night I saw her curtains twitch. I saw her lights stay on until dawn. She didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. And for the first time since moving here, I slept soundly. Because power was shifting, and Karen knew it. But she wasn't done fighting, not yet. The more her control slipped, the more dangerous she became. And soon, her desperation would push her to a place even fear couldn't hold her back from. Everyone heard the scream before they saw her. It was a Saturday morning, quiet, the kind where families watered their lawns and kids rode bikes in circles down the street. But then, her voice ripped through the calm like glass shattering. Enough, I won't be ignored anymore. Neighbors rushed to their windows. Curtains parted. Garage doors froze halfway down. Karen was standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, hair uncombed, robe hanging open, her gun clenched so tight her knuckles were white. The HOA president was no longer a polished tyrant. She was a storm unraveling in front of everyone. She spun in circles, shouting at houses, at driveways, at shadows. You think you can plot against me? You think I don't see what's happening? I run this neighborhood, I built it. Without me, you're nothing. Every word trembled with rage, but underneath there was fear. My chest tightened. This was it, the moment when someone cornered finally bites. I glanced at my son who stood beside me at the porch. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't shaken. His face was stone, his eyes fixed on her. Do we call the cops? I whispered. He shook his head slowly. No, not yet. Neighbors gathered now, cautiously stepping into their driveways. Whispers spread like sparks in dry grass. Parents pulled children inside, doors clicked shut. But no one left completely. They couldn't. It was like a train wreck they had to watch. Karen raised the gun, pointing it, not at anyone, not yet, but up at the sky. Her voice cracked as she screamed, "This is MY community. I decide what happens here." And then her eyes locked on us. Her arm dropped, the barrel swinging toward my son. The street froze. I could feel every heartbeat in my throat. But he didn't move, he didn't flinch, he didn't even breathe differently. He just stood there calm, hands loose at his sides, his gaze steady on hers. The silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. And then in that stillness he spoke. "You've already lost, Karen." His voice was low, steady, but it carried across the street like a shot. Her face twisted. "Shut up, don't you dare talk to me like—" "You're not in control anymore." He cut her off, his words precise, measured, the way I'd heard drill instructors bark orders on old training tapes. "Look around." And for the first time, she did. She saw the neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns. She saw the HOA board members standing shoulder to shoulder, their arms crossed, their eyes cold. No one supported her. No one backed her, not anymore. Her power wasn't real, it was borrowed, fed by their fear. And now fear was gone. "You ruled with threats," my son continued, his tone still even. "But threats only work when people believe you're untouchable. They don't believe that anymore." Karen's hand trembled, the gun wavered. "Put it down," he said softly. Her voice cracked. "I can't." "You can," he said, eyes locked on hers. "Because right now the only thing that bullet can hit is your own reputation. Pull that trigger and it's not just a fine, it's not just an HOA violation, it's your freedom, your life." Her breathing hitched. For the first time, doubt flickered in her eyes. The crowd pressed in not physically but with silence, watching, judging, waiting. And that silence was louder than any words. "You wanted everyone to fear you," my son said, softer now, almost a whisper. "But fear doesn't last, respect does, and you don't have that anymore." Her shoulders sagged. The weight of the gun pulled her arm lower, lower, until finally it pointed at the ground. And then it slipped from her hand, clattering onto the pavement. A collective breath released across the street. Karen fell to her knees, her hands shaking, her eyes darting like a trapped animal. I just wanted." Her words dissolved into broken sobs. No one moved to comfort her. Not even the board members who once stood at her side. Because everyone knew the truth. This wasn't strength breaking. This was power crumbling. The police came minutes later, sirens cutting through the stillness. Neighbors stepped back, clearing the way. Officers disarmed her, cuffed her, guided her into the back of a cruiser. Her face, pale and streaked with tears, pressed against the glass as the car pulled away. And the street, our street, was silent again. But this silence wasn't fear. It was relief. I turned to my son. "You didn't even flinch," I whispered. He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. That's what training is for. I studied him, the calm, the stillness, the control, and I realized something. He hadn't just stood against Karen, he had taught everyone else how to stand too. Because courage is contagious. And once one person shows it, fear doesn't stand a chance. The cruiser's taillights disappeared down the road, and for the first time in months, the street was truly still. No clipboard. No barking orders. No shadow watching from behind lace curtains. Just silence. Neighbors lingered in their driveways, whispering in hushed tones, shaking their heads like they were waking from a long, uneasy dream. Kids crept back outside, clutching basketballs, bikes, chalk. Parents let them. Laughter returned cautiously, fragile at first, but real. And in that fragile moment, I realized something. The neighborhood hadn't just been held hostage by Karen's rules. It had been held hostage by fear. Fear of fines. Fear of confrontation. Fear of standing alone. But that grip was broken now. I turned to my son. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, gaze still fixed on the empty street where the squad car had vanished. He hadn't moved. He hadn't spoken. But he didn't need to. The weight of what just happened clung to him like a second skin. I whispered, "It's over." His jaw tightened just slightly. It's never really over. Fear doesn't disappear overnight. People forget what it's like to live free. They need to learn again. And he was right. The days that followed were quiet but different. The HOA board scrambled, holding emergency sessions, trying to rewrite bylaws, restructure leadership. For the first time, neighbors showed up not out of obligation, but out of curiosity, out of hope. I sat in the back of the clubhouse during those meetings, watching faces that once avoided each other now leaning close, talking, sharing ideas. No one raised their voice. No one waved papers like weapons. And though my son never sat on the board, never volunteered, never even spoke in those rooms, they always glanced at him. A silent acknowledgement. A reminder of what it took to reach this point. Karen's house stood empty for weeks. The blinds stayed closed, the lawn overgrew, the mailbox overflowed. It was strange, how quickly a place that once felt like the center of everything became invisible, like it was waiting to be erased from memory. But trauma doesn't vanish. It lingers in the edges, it whispers in the back of your mind. I caught neighbors still hesitating before letting kids play too loud. I saw couples stop mid-laughter, glancing at the empty windows across the street as if expecting her to appear. And that's when I realized, Karen's legacy wasn't the rules she wrote, it was the fear she planted. Fear takes root fast, pulling it out takes longer. One evening I sat with my son on the porch, the air cool, the sky painted orange and pink. He was silent, as always, watching the street. "You broke her," I said softly. His eyes flicked to me, then back to the horizon. "She broke herself." I frowned, "But you pushed her." He nodded once. "That's what pressure does, it shows cracks. She lived on control, but control built on fear can't hold forever. All I did was remind her of that." There was no pride in his voice, no gloating, just fact. I thought about everything. About the bullet that whistled past my boy, about the nights Karen screamed into the dark, about the neighbors who lived in silence, afraid to breathe wrong. And then I thought about this moment. The stillness, the laughter trickling back, the sound of a basketball bouncing 2 houses down. "Sometimes," I murmured, more to myself than to him, "strength isn't about fighting. It's about waiting long enough for the enemy to destroy themselves." He didn't answer, he didn't need to. His silence was agreement enough. Weeks later, a for sale sign finally appeared in Karen's yard. The lawn was trimmed, the house cleaned, the shutters painted. It looked normal, ordinary, like nothing had ever happened. But when the moving trucks came, no one waved. No one helped. No one said goodbye. Because ghosts don't deserve farewells. When the new family arrived, a young couple with 2 kids, neighbors lined the streets, smiling, bringing casseroles and cookies. It wasn't just about welcoming them. It was about reclaiming something they'd lost. And for the first time since we moved in, the neighborhood felt alive. I watched it all unfold from the porch. Kids running barefoot across lawns, parents laughing, board members shaking hands instead of pointing fingers. And through it all, my son sat beside me, quiet, steady, the same way he'd been since the beginning. I turned to him. "You know, you changed everything here." He shook his head. "No, they changed themselves. I just gave them space to see what she really was." I studied him, the calm, the discipline, the weight he carried like armor. He wasn't just my son anymore. He was something more. A reminder that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never raise their voice, never throw a punch, never fire a shot. Because strength isn't always loud. Sometimes strength is silence. Sometimes strength is patience. Sometimes strength is the calm stare that makes fear collapse under its own weight. The neighborhood would heal, the fear would fade, and Karen, she would be remembered but not missed. As the sun dipped low, painting the street in gold, my son finally spoke. "You see that?" He nodded toward the children playing, their laughter ringing like music. I smiled. "Yeah, what about it?" "That," he said quietly, "is why I didn't flinch." And in that moment, I understood. He wasn't just protecting himself. He wasn't just standing against her. He was standing for them. For all of us. And the neighborhood, finally free, finally alive, would never forget it. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one. The truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.